Would you like your white balancing tool to be smaller? Still too big? This is ExpoDis, a portable and convenient tool for setting your white balance and exposure. In this video, I'm going to test it from the perspective of a videographer and see if it really makes setting your white balance easier and faster. I would like to give a huge shout out to ExpoDis for making my first giveaway happen. I have 2 sets to give away, so stay tuned to the end of the video to find out how to participate. I would like to point out that although ExpoDis did send its products over, this is not a sponsored video, and as always, you can expect to hear my honest opinion. Without further ado, let's play the intro and get this review started. Hey guys, what's up? My name is Bernard and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I'll be testing out the ExpoDis V3 and see if it does indeed help improve my workflow when it comes to setting exposure and white balance for my camera in video mode. Why is this important? Because unlike our buddies doing photography, shooting RAW is not really an option for most of us. We need to try and get everything right in camera as we have more limitations, and also because we don't want to waste valuable time in post-production fixing our mistakes. Therefore, I try to get everything right during production so I don't give my editors a headache while editing. At the moment, I have a few methods of setting my white balance, but each has its cons. My go-to method in a controlled shooting environment is to use a white balance card. Although effective and reliable, my problem with this is that I need to carry one of these tools around, and that could get quite troublesome. It is also very tedious to have to walk to where my subject is, set down the white balance card, walk back to my camera, set my white balance, go back to my subject to keep my white balance card, and walk back to my camera. And look at what happened in this scenario. The wind blew it away, and I swear to you, this was not staged. This actually happened while I was filming. Another con of this method is that sometimes you don't have a clean place to set down your white balance card, and it is natural to not want to get it dirty. My second method of setting my white balance is to eyeball it, and I do this 80% of the time. I usually get it right, but there are certain situations that will confuse me, especially in mixed lighting situations, or when a light has a certain tint to it. A color shift caused by my variable ND filters would also not be able to be taken into consideration when judging the temperature of the environment. It is also time consuming to manually dial in all the correct settings, even if I do manage to figure out what the right settings are. This is where the ExpoDis would come in. I'm hoping that it will be a reliable and convenient method to set my white balance. Only one way to find out, and that is to test it in a few situations. Before I show you the sample footage, I want to show you how it works. You begin by setting up your scene as you normally would. Once you have decided where your subject and your camera is going to be, it is now time to use the ExpoDis to set your white balance. In this scenario, my subject are the board game covers that are being held up by the tripod, and what I will then need to do is to pick up my camera, bring it over, and stand right next to my subject. Place the ExpoDis right in front of the lens, point the camera at the direction where I will be shooting from, and set my exposure and white balance. To set your white balance, what you need to do is to adjust your exposure to make sure that your histogram lands right in the center. Once there, you set your white balance depending on how your camera does it. For your exposure, the way to do this is by adjusting your exposure till the camera meter reads what you normally want it to be. In my case, since I am filming in S-Log 3, I set it to plus 1.7. Once that is all done, you go back to where your camera is supposed to be and you're ready to start shooting. I know you must be thinking now, wait, you still have to walk up to your subject and back. How is that different from using a white balance card? Well, for starters, it is one trip less. Also, the ExpoDis is much more portable than a white balance card. Yes, I agree that it is not a perfect solution. Originally, I thought that all I had to do was to hold the ExpoDis in front of the lens, point it at my subject from where I want to film from, and set my white balance that way. Well, if only there is such a thing as a perfect product, but unfortunately, there isn't. However, I do think that the ExpoDis is more convenient in certain situations, but let me elaborate on that later. For now, let me show you the results of the examples I shot. In our first scenario, we have a sunny day in an outdoor scene at noon. In this example, I left it to the camera to decide all the settings. So I set it to auto white balance and shutter priority with an exposure compensation of plus 1.7. For the next example, I set all my settings manually, just looking off the screen of the camera without any tools. I would also like to take this time to point out that all the footage was shot in S-Log3 and the only thing done in post-production was to slap on a conversion LUT. Nothing else was done. For the third example, I used the white balance card to set my white balance and false colors to set my exposure, which is the combination I use on set whenever I have the time. I made sure that my subject was at the ideal exposure, which probably explains why the rest of the scene looks a bit darker. This can of course be easily fixed by color correcting, but I wanted to show you the footage straight out of the camera. Lastly, I used the Expo Disc to set my white balance, and to my surprise, the camera registered the scene as slightly warm and set it to 4900 Kelvin. Looking at all the examples side by side, I like the colors of the image with white balance that I set with my eyes and the exposure of the image that I use false colors. Let's take a look at the next scenario to see if the results are replicated. In the next scene, we are still filming outdoors at noon, but this time I am filming in a shady area. I'll be following the same order as the previous set of examples, starting with auto everything. Overall, it looks decent to me, but it is slightly cool. Next, I am deciding everything based on how it looks off the back of my camera screen. Looking at the image now, I do think that it's a little bit too warm, but it can easily be fixed. The results of the white cut is the one that shocked me the most. The camera registered the scene as very cool and I ended up with 9300 Kelvin. I thought it looked weird and tested it again, but I got the same results. Therefore, I am posting it here for you to see. Lastly, we have the image using the Expo Disc. I think the scene looks a little overexposed, but the colors look alright to me. Looking at the images side by side, I like the exposure and white balance that I got using my eyes the most. In our third scene, we have a mixed lighting scene. We have the blinds open with daylight coming in and the house lights, which is warm, switched on. This is an example of what I usually find to be challenging. As I have everything on auto, you can see that the camera chose to not blow out the highlights, which is why the subject is underexposed. Moving on to the next example, I manually adjusted the settings based on my eyes and even added some magenta tint as I found the room to be a little too green. I exposed for the subject, which is why the windows are a little blown out. When I used the white cut, my camera reading was quite similar to what I set with my eyes, but more magenta tint was added. By using false colors, I believe I got a better exposure here. Lastly, when I used the Expo Disc, my exposure was way off. I found this to be a common occurrence when I used it indoors. I have to underexpose the meter reading to get a better exposure. Ultimately, I decided to use false colors to get a more accurate exposure, but I still obtained the white balance with the Expo Disc. Looking at everything side by side, I like the white balance set by the Expo Disc the most and the exposure set by false colors. In our last example, we have an indoor setting with just warm lights, the kind you typically find at home or in indoor spaces. Also, I want to show you how it will look if the white balance was set to daylight in camera, so you have a good reference. Next, we'll be adjusting all the settings based on my eyes. Thirdly, we have our white cut and false colors. Lastly, we have our Expo Disc, and like the earlier example, the exposure was slightly too bright, although it was not as bad as before. So here is an example of white balance with Expo Disc and the exposure set with false colors. I also want to take a moment to show you how it will look if I set my white balance with my eyes, and I wanted to have some creative control to give the room a slightly warm ambient. In this final scenario, I think that the white cut and Expo Disc tight if you wanted something as neutral as possible, but it also goes to show that you have less creative control if you wanted the room to look slightly warm. Now comes the part that you've been waiting for. Before I share with you my thoughts on the Expo Disc, here are the giveaway details. To participate, firstly, you have to be subscribed to this YouTube channel. Next, head over to Expo Disc and my Instagram to follow our accounts. The details will be placed on the screen and I will include links in the description as well. Once done, comment that you have done everything that is required on my IG post that is announcing this giveaway and tag a friend in that comment. In 2 weeks of the release of this video, I will select 2 people at random to get an Expo Disc for free. Do make sure that your account can receive direct messages so I can reach out to you for your mailing details. Good luck and thanks for being a part of my first giveaway. Anyways, back to the topic on hand. So what are my thoughts on this product? For starters, I would not want to rely on this tool for exposure when it comes to video. I think the best way to set exposure has always been false colors, and it will stay that way for a long time to come. But when it comes to setting white balance, this is where the product would really come in handy, but only in certain situations. I think the best place to use this product would be when you're filming in indoor spaces, for events or weddings where the pace is super fast and there are challenging lighting conditions. What I would do is, with the Expo Disc, go to various positions of the venue and capture the white balance of the different angles you might be filming at. I will then save each reading into a preset. With the Sony cameras, I can save up to 3. During the shoot, I will then toggle between the 3 and see which works best. The reason why the Expo Disc will be better than a white balance card in this scenario is because I won't have to keep walking to and fro to set up and keep the card. Also, in a tight and busy event space, I might not be able to do that easily. With the Expo Disc, everything stays in my hand, and when I am not using it, it easily fits into my pocket. But here are some situations where I would not be using the Expo Disc. In an interview setup, especially with 2 or more cameras, it is going to be way easier to walk over and place the white balance card where my subject is and to point all my cameras at it, as opposed to carrying all my cameras to my subject multiple times after having it all framed up nicely. I also won't use either of these tools in a situation where I want more creative control to set the scene to be warmer or cooler. Overall, as with every camera product, there is a time and place for each tool, and there is no one-size-fits-all sort of thing. What do you think? Comment what situation would the Expo Disc be best. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you did. That's pretty much it for today. It's a wrap!